are rolling.
All right, Jesus, Joe, Daniel, it's good to see all of you.
Good to see you. Good to be here.
All right, so we are here in lovely Aspen, Colorado, with the Aspen Ascend VisionXChange. So all of us are Aspen Ascend Fellows in the same class, the Fellowship of the Ring. This is a subset of, the men of the ring, minus a couple people. So my name's Jay Chaudhary. I'm one of the fellows here. And before we jump in, I would just like to go around the horn and have folks introduce themselves. So, Jesus.
Sure. And yeah, very happy to not only be spending time with you guys up in Aspen, but get a chance to do this. Jesús Gerena. I am the CEO and president of UpTogether, a national organization that understands that poverty is a policy choice. And we must shift the way our policies and our values align to be able to help and support those who are experiencing financial hardship by investing directly in them, their strengths, their abilities. I'll toss it over to Joe.
I'm Joe Waters. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Capita, a think tank and community committed to working with leaders to ensure a future in which all families and their communities flourish.
And I'm Daniel Williams. I'm the president and CEO of the Steelcase Foundation. We work in West Michigan County and are focused on supporting a thriving K-12 public education system.
All right, I'm Jay Chaudhary. I was most recently the director of the Indiana Division of Mental Health and Addiction, but I'm currently a fellow at a think tank called Sagamore Institute. And so, we can jump right in. We're here in Aspen for what's called the VisionXChange, which is all of the Ascend fellows from over a dozen years of cohorts have come together to talk and think and reimagine and figure out a new and better way forward for children and families. And one of the themes that has emerged both during this time but also in conversations with all of you is this notion of incremental change from within the system versus reimagining or rethinking the system as a whole. And I think all of you know, as the kind of resident state government insider advocate, I'm a little more skeptical than the three of you about the notion of tearing something down to build something up better, because I think there's a lot of collateral damage that could come from the tearing it down that I want to be cognizant of. But I would love to have you convince me why I'm short-sighted.
I don't know that I would say tear it down, Jay. My view would be much more that government needs to do what government does well.
Sure.
And what government does best, and I think we know this especially from the experiment of the New Deal, is redistribute wealth and power. What government doesn't do well are programs and services. And since the Great Society in particular, we're trying to service our way or program our way to better outcomes for children and families. So I'm not necessarily the view that it should be torn down so much as we need to refocus, particularly at the government level, on the redistribution of wealth and power.
Sure, absolutely.
Can I just jump into that, Joe? And I'd be curious what you think of also the fact that we've walked away from a government perspective in supporting the commons and the places where we meet as a community and in exchange in both ideas and action to be able to support one another and our neighbors. Because I do agree, not to step over quickly, that what the New Deal was structuring a whole set of different dollars that invested directly in people for them to, again, find worth, because there was a lack of worth due to corruption and also disinvestment over the years of individuals. But there was also this place where it was also important for people to connect and support one another. And all those things we've stopped investing in as well. And I see those two things as really valuable, but I'd be curious about your position.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the quintessential New Deal programs in my book is the Rural Electrification Administration, which was all about distributing wealth through grants and loans to communities across the country, building infrastructure. In the 1930s, 1 in 10 farms were electrified. By the mid-1950s, 9 in 10 farms were electrified, and then handing that over to the community in the form of what today are about 400, as I understand it, rural electric cooperatives in the country that are run, governed, and owned by local communities. So I agree with you.
Let me zoom out for a second and bring Daniel in. And so, we're in Aspen at the Aspen Institute, which is sort of the cathedral to neoliberalism in a way, right? In a way, this is sort of one of, if you may named 10 institutions that were most indicative of this concept, I think Aspen would be one of them. And that don't know they disagree. I've heard in various conversations with all three of you sort of push back against the whole idea and operating ethos of what neoliberalism is. So I'm wondering if, Daniel, if you can maybe unpack that a little bit.
Just unpack neoliberalism real quick.
Unpack, why you think.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think it. This is probably why you're asking the question, because it's connected to this conversation that we we're just having, which is this hyper focus on individual attainment, and that shift to identify, commodifying everything and trying to sort of just accumulate more and more and more, has created this, and Joe, you talked about this a lot, but it's created this space where everyone's like, the question is, what am I getting? What am I getting from this? What am I getting? And we've seen it in the current political rhetoric where, it's like, oh, that's not for me. Oh, they're not talking to me, as opposed to this like broader idea of like these broader investments that support our entire community holistically, and how that moves us together forward. And so when we start pulling those things out, and this happens in education, the neoliberal constraints around education of, we need to test every individual, and it's about, we're going to, in this hyper specific proficiency test is going to determine if you're a good teacher, if you're a good school, if you're and then we're going to, layer in what we say is choice, but really isn't choice, and sort of try to build all of this into that. It mucks up the systems in a way that allows for individuals to say, I want better for me or my kids, and it's so inward focused that we end up pulling resources from the collective.
Yeah, and so I think that's where I was trying to get at with this original prompt, was like, I feel like all three of you, and Joe in particular, we've talked about the need for not only, different policy-making approaches, different strategies, but also like a new framework, on which to kind of hang and scaffold them. So I don't know if Joe and Jesus, if you want to weigh in on that.
Can I just say quickly, I mean, going back to your original question, though, like given these 3 points, I think when you look at government today, and I think your framework in thinking about what good policy looks like, I don't see how you can repair what has been decades worth of work that has structured this individualistic approaches without sort of tearing it down first and then building from there. And I think that's a struggle where I know that we had this a little bit of a conversation earlier, where it's like, well, we can band-aid our way through improving it, but will it get us to where we want to achieve, which is going back in this collective society and believing that we can thrive as a community rather than as individuals.
Yeah, in the framework we've started to call common good pluralism, which is this idea that, since 2008 in particular, neoliberalism as a political order has begun to falter. MAGA offers one version of what might come next. I think abundance is another version of what might come next. But we've offered this thing that we call common good pluralism, which is really about putting families and communities at the center of our political order and then building out from there. There are a lot of ways that I think it would look like the New Deal, but obviously in the last 80, 85 years, we've learned a lot. We've grown a lot as a country, and simply replicating the political order of the 1930s is not going to work. And we really think families and communities and the stability, quality, and predictability of family and community life across the country needs to be front and center of our political order moving forward. Not just the maximization of profit, the maximization of short-term gain, the maximization of consumption, which I would argue really characterize the neoliberal order.
And can I ask just a follow-up, because you identified 2008 sort of being, and I'm just curious, how you and your team have landed on that as the timeline? Is it like
Just the
'cause
financial
the implication
crisis,
is that it was working almost before that? And I'm just curious, like, could you unpack that part of it a little bit?
I mean, I think that there were probably aspects of it that were working or at least they were working in a way that we were not as aware of the faults, right? But I think since the financial crisis in 2008, the faults of neoliberalism, the cracks in neoliberalism are much more apparent. And I think in some ways the Tea Party was an initial response to this. Certainly Trump in 2016 is a response to this as well.
I really appreciate that, like, and thinking about it from that point of like 2008 and the financial crisis, when we are at that point in a human-made crisis, we bail out and open our checkbooks to try to salvage those cracks that became huge holes, right, in our systems. And we keep in that course until then a different crisis hits, and we go the other way. We go closer to what the New Deal is, and what you're saying as common good pluralism as COVID hit,
right?
And yet we've walked back that, right? But that's a
and
I really appreciate that.
It'd be interesting to think about what the sort of New Deal Roosevelt-esque response to 2008 would have been, which would have been him, as he was in the 1936 campaign, railing against the economic royalists, right? And it would have been big investments in communities, big investments in underserved regions of the country, like the Tennessee Valley. It would not have been bailing out the banks.
I wonder in this sort of...
Though, of course, he did that too. But,
but I just wonder in this conversation, right, that there's sort of the underlying... It's like if we're building on fault lines or if we're building in floodplains, and it's all, it seems fine until 2008 or until, right? Like, so, like, if we're creating our systems on shaky ground, inevitably a flood's going to come. Inevitably, we were building in a hurricane alley, like a hurricane's going to come, right? And then that's when we sort of like, we need to come together and do, and so I guess the question that I have for the group is like, how might we begin to have conversations? And maybe this is like breaking the system. It's like, if the thing is built on the fault line to begin with, is that ever something that's viable? And how do we do this and push to move to something new, to the bigger ideas, that when it doesn't require us rallying around some horrible tragedy, or like,
sure.
Like how do we begin to create urgency when there isn't an emergency?
That's a great, and then to kind of synthesize, maybe I think Joe, what he's offering and what we've taught is a positive vision, right? For that, I think MAGA in particular it does not have a positive vision. It's like all this stuff's broken, and here's what we're going to do about it. And I think an answer that maybe, Joe, you'd argue, and maybe we can get to some grounding here, because this is really high level abstract. But
are they saying here all the stuff is broken, and here's what we're going to do about it? Or are they saying,
or all the stuff's who's to blame? Here's whose fault it is, right? Like,
and they want to gut it.
Yeah.
And not replace it in any sense, except for, you're going to have more money in your pocket. Trust me.
Right.
Which
there's a huge element of trust me. Yeah. There's a wink, right?
Sorry, finish what you're saying.
Well, so I think I'd like to ground this a little bit more. So let's talking about something I think we all, in some form or fashion, agree on in terms of what should be the principles on which this new system is built on, which are things like agency, control, choice, and cash. Right. I think like all of us are proponents. And Jesus, it's your job, but I mean, in general, all of us are advocates of things that are sort of direct cash assistance. And before we get to that specifically, as a sort of a grounding example of what we're talking about, I wonder if any of you want to offer comments on those principles and what they mean to you.
Same again.
All right, agency, control, and choice, like community. I mean, there's a million of them, but just sort of the notion of centering, communities and people in this conversation.
I mean, what I'll say quickly is I always think of them as a grounding of, the promise of, you pick the year of the of the Constitution, of the founding of this experiment, which was, hey, like, we don't want others making decisions for us. We want to be able to prosper in the way that we see fit, and we want to do that in a sense with a certain amount of autonomy, right? That still has some interconnectedness, but it provided, and that to me, I think at all times, I find the challenge is how much we have walked away from that with like the shield of the Constitution and sort of that promise saying, no, we're going to get better at it if we abandon those principles. And I mean, that to me is always how I think of them.
Well, Dan, earlier you sort of hinted at the illusion of choice that's baked into a lot of our stuff. Like, can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think that we like as a parent, one of the things that one of the like the tools you pick up is like, I'm going to offer two choices that make you feel like you have a choice. Yeah. Like, do you want to eat your broccoli right now, or or in 10 minutes? And so what ends up happening is it's sort of this like illusion of choice, but really sort of a dictating direction. And I think we need to be more. I think we just need to be more open and more transparent about when there's actual choice, when there isn't, why there is and why there isn't. And we throw around community, and you all have heard me say this before. I think we need to be careful in how we throw this word community around, and we act as though that like, everyone just knows community needs to have a voice. Community this, community that. Like, whose community? When? Who does that include, and who does that not include? People they're identifying that in a particular way, and so often we lead into that. We say like community. People on the ground know the answer, and it's like, no, which answer to what thing, and with what additional information, and who are we talking about? And so we get into these sort of vague things that get snaps in the room, but don't mean a lot when unless we're like really clear about what we're saying, and then what those choices are, and what the potential negative impacts are of those choices, which there just inevitably will be.
Of course.
And of course, the premise of the founding of this country was not the maximization of individual choice. It was that we could govern ourselves. And one of the things that we've never fully realized, we've gotten much better when it comes to political democracy, including more and more Americans. Still have a ways to go with Puerto Rico. But we've gotten better on political democracy. We've not taken those democratic values, the values that we can govern ourselves, into the economy in the same way.
That's a great point.
And so what I would like to see is a system that is much more balanced in favor of economic democracy, that ownership is broadly distributed, that we participate more in the governance of businesses and enterprises large and small. And that doesn't just mean worker cooperatives. It doesn't just mean employee stock ownership. There's a whole range of ways that we can distribute participation in the decision making and distribute the benefits of what is the largest economy the world has ever seen.
Yeah, and I'd love to pull on that thread because, Daniel, you mentioned to me last time we talked or a while back about this idea of like public equity, right? So like the public should have a stake in things that public dollars played a role in developing. And I think that is an example, Joe, that's more
Absolutely.
than just, employee-owned company or stock ownership, but, give us some examples of that.
Yeah, I mean, and so the hard part is sometimes you can start saying examples and it's like, oh, it's just that, and really the thing that I'm sort of wrestling with or trying to understand more is I think what you're saying, Joe, which is like on a broader scale, like how do we reimagine the way that we talk about and this gets into like direct cash payment when it gets into these things, as long as we're thinking of anytime the government gives, I'm using that language, right?
Sure.
Somebody something, it's like, it's seen as this handout. It's seen as this this transaction that like this is our taxpayer money going to you so you can have get food stamps or have this direct cash. What are you going to do with it? Because it's my money that you're taking. And my wondering is how a larger shift in that conversation around we have collectively pooled our money to invest in a whole host of innovation, right? The internet, AI, like all of these things,
COVID vaccines,
yeah. Right? All of these things that exist that shareholders and a few people are reaping the massive. There's multi-billionaires who are making multi-billion dollars off of things that we have collectively invested in, and we need to stop thinking about any redistribution as a gift to lowly you. No, these are dividends. These are returns on the investments that we've collectively made that should come back more holistically to everybody. And that part of it, I think, is a shift in language that I think could have a kind of reach across. Is I don't know. I don't have the right language for that, but I feel like there's
your point about reaching across, though. I mean, at the very least, some of the rhetoric of like a J.D. Vance or even a Trump, when it comes to railing against corporatism, in theory, if you thought they were operating in good faith, which is a different conversation, but it does line up with this notion of like citizens have an equity stake in all of these things, and that I think is a potential reframe that we need to talk more about. There's AI is being currently just supported by massive both direct subsidies and also like indirect subsidies in the form of data centers and all of this, and it's going to reap massive profits for us right now, a select few people, and this is the time to have the conversation about that equity stake, I think. Which brings us to, I think, Jesus, the notion of cash assistance, which maybe give us a elevator pitch about what it is, given that that's your organization's role in it, and then we can talk about kind of some ins and outs.
I mean, I'll just repeat what's already been said, which is essentially looking at people for their worth and understanding that rather than programs and services to try to correct the challenges that they're meeting in their lives, is actually easing the financial strains and putting this choice back in their hands so that they have the ability to make new choices with the cushion of not being strained by, can I feed my kids tomorrow? Can I pay my rent this month? Can I get to a new job if I had a car? You eliminate some of those pressures by depending on how much you invest in them. And we do somewhere between $500 and $1,000, but really it's up to our imagination as how much. And I really appreciated your Daniel, the conversation around dividends, because what do we want from people, right? Do we want them to struggle, or do we want them to benefit from our collective good, from our collective ingenuity? How do we spark, I think, ideas? And when you put that money in people's hands, ideas are sparked. People know, they begin to think about their households as an enterprise, and they're like, okay, do I need to build bigger assets with my children? Or do I go after education? Do I get a new job? Do I get a car? Right? And they figure it out. And I think that unlocks that unlocks this sort of continuous thinking of, this is the only way you can do this. And by the way, if you do too good, we're going to penalize you. And if you don't do enough, we're going to penalize you. You're walking this thin line at all times, which is called survival. And that puts a huge strain on people.
Yeah, and some of those things you mentioned are so hard to measure by the conventional metrics of an individually focused society, which brings us to, we're recording this on the same day as a New York Times piece came out, which reflected the findings of a longitudinal study over a period of 4 or 5 years, I think, showing, and going to the finding was that guaranteed income or direct cash assistance had negligible impact on the predetermined outcomes that folks were measuring. And disclaimer, all of us, I think, just read this article today, so have not had a chance to kind of process it and dig into the findings. But What were your kind of gut level reactions? I guess I'll throw it to anybody else about what this means and how we should sort of deal with it or not deal with it.
Can I just say, I think just to my own understanding of the results that have been like the biggest for the headlines to the New York Times is, they looked at kids who didn't get the money versus kids that did, and sort of did these developmental brain scans and said, like everything is the same. So cash doesn't have necessarily in that context variable impact yet. And that was the big thing.
I think they also track like levels of anxiety and those types of things.
Yeah.
They say, in the article too, that also this is right at the tail end of COVID. And so there was different kinds of other supports in this moment in time that may have made things. I think the concern I have anytime anything like this comes out is the confirmation bias situation where it's, we take a little bit of something, and we do this out of studies all the time, right? Yeah. Like this big study with complex, and all these results, and they pour over all this information, and someone takes one little nugget of it and, makes it a headline, and then it's like, that means this. And I think part of what we all should be doing is consistently working to learn, like staying so curious, like, so it isn't, this isn't the right thing. It's like, what does this mean? What are the questions that this brings up as opposed to conclusions that we're making? The amount of money per month was not very much. Was the length of time over 3 or 4 years, or was that how long they tracked?
They tracked it.
But the length of time wasn't 4 years that they were getting money.
Which is funny because I don't think in the article it said exactly how long.
It didn't identify that. So it's like, of course there's not long-term impacts for $300 a month for a year. Like what? Like in what world would that, and so we keep moving into things as if there's these silver bullets, or it's like, if we just do this, and as soon as anyone says, if we just do whatever, fill in the blank, like we immediately know we're not in the right spot. Like we have to be more curious. We have to be asking more questions.
And what's measured is an individual solution because it's considered an individual problem.
And it's a solution and it's focused only on the child, right? So it doesn't measure, for example, the sense of dignity that a parent feels when they're able to take their child out to eat for their birthday, right? I think we're a wealthy enough country that we can give people money. We can make sure that people have the money to do the sorts of things that help them have have a sense of dignity, a sense of meaning, a purpose, a sense of belonging in their community, right? So the study didn't measure dignity, right?
Nope.
It measured child outcomes and a handful of developmental outcomes at that. So there are a lot of things here that I think didn't get measured. And the other thing that I would note is I don't think there was anything about the particular neighborhoods that these families lived in. We know that neighborhoods matter a lot, and $300 a month is not enough probably to help you move out of an unsafe neighborhood to a safe neighborhood where your kids have access to parks and so forth. And I think it's also noticeable that they just sort of glided over the fact that in almost all the households, fathers were not present. And my view is that the gold standard for child well-being is 2 cooperating parents. Not only does that have economic benefits, but it has social, emotional, psychological benefits as well. And $300 is not going to bring an absent parent a month is not going to bring an absent parent back into a child's life. So there are other factors that I think are critical and probably deserve both further study and further discussion.
Can we dig into this? Or go ahead.
Well, yeah, I'm having a reaction. And I want to say it, but I'm also like, this is sort of rough draft thinking, so I want to be careful with how I use language. But Joe, we've talked before about some of the 2-parent, like research around two-parent households and those types of things. And I've said to you, like, my concern and my worry about that is there's this leap of logic that's like mixes up correlation and causation, and that and even sort of like language like absent parents, right? Like that's rooted in a whole host of other things. And we know that families, especially in lower income families, like fathers are the same, if not more engaged with their kids, but they may not live with them. Right. And there's a whole host of reasons why that is.
They're incentivized not to be participating.
And parents are incentivized to keep them off paperwork and those types of things. And so then you've got like mass incarceration, like so. And I don't want to get on like the spiral of like, well, and this because I understand like the larger point. I just always want to I always feel like we need to be careful that because someone hears that and they might say, oh, he's saying if people are just married, it'll be fine, right?
Oh, not at all. Not at all. And I think mass incarceration is a great example, right, of where that not only has mass incarceration been a systemic effort, right, to over police certain communities and engage them in criminal justice system that really creates a flywheel effect where they stay in that system. But mass incarceration has been government removal of a lot of fathers from their lives of their children, from the lives of their neighborhoods, from the lives of their partners. And we have to own and acknowledge that it isn't just, if people would get married and stay married, everything would be fine. But I think it warrants discussion that we maybe are not having.
Dr. Andre Perry with Brookings Institute has his new book is one of the things he talks about, because he says two-parent households is a predictor of long-term. So, and he's looking at life expectancy, and he says, well, that's a predictor of general wealth and well-being, or health and well-being, and that is one of the things that comes up, and often folks are kind of uneasy with that. And the way he talks about it, he said, he's and he says the same thing about education. He believes through his research that education isn't a predictor of wealth. Wealth is a predictor of education, and two-parent households isn't a predictor. Wealth is a predictor of two-parent households. If you have you're secure and you have money and you're not, like, all the things that come with poverty make it really difficult to build the kind of connected relationship. And so so he really pushes us to reimagine that, and it's like which one is the cart and which one is the horse,
right?
Yeah,
right. And what I think I would say is stability, quality, predictability. These are the things that matter. And for most kids,
there we go,
fathers in their lives, right, in whatever way makes sense, is a source of predictability and stability. For a lot of kids, though, it's not, right? And we have to acknowledge the situation that those kids are in as well.
Bring Jesus in here.
Yeah, no, but I want to go back to, because it still traces back to the common good and pluralism. Like, if we are providing as a society, and everything you're saying spot on has been my experience as well, Daniel, it's like, how do we help support these individual households to thrive and to have the choices to make good choices in their lives? And the for me, it's always important to note that people do know what's good for them, especially when they have children, because everybody's always thinking about what is best for them and how to be able to navigate. And money is a huge pressure in that. And especially when a system is continuously trying to dictate and program and service you as to how you get to raise those children. I think that's important. That it's also as we think of the larger, what do we want to promote? And then the other thing I wanted to add quickly is, going back to the study work, I mean, we're having this conversation because of it. And I know that there's even more to be had. I think research-based studies, such as RCTs, can be really important to ask what's next and how does it complement what's already has happened in the field. And the truth is, like, to me, one of the things is, we did an RCT in Oakland, 300 households, where we saw post-COVID, or as COVID was happening and after, that parents, as a result, there was a larger amount of money. So they were getting $500 a month for 2 years total. Their kids actually improved their grades during that time. And the parents had more time to be able to dedicate to their kids' education as well as to participate in school. And the kids in the control group actually lost academic achievement, right? So that runs against some of these findings, which says, okay, well, hold on. What was different? How do we begin to look at other work to be able to complement? And sadly, I think we start getting into the, oh, what's the headline here? Oh, this doesn't work, our confirmation bias, and move on to the next subject because all of a sudden this has been defeated. And I think that it's the wrong way to be able to approach this, as well as sort of the general purpose of the study to begin with, which I would argue, hey, what was the community input on what the success of this cash impact would be, right? And I think both of those things are being missed right now.
And Daniel Patrick Moynihan always said, social scientific evaluation is about the past. It's not predictive of the future, right? And so there could be other models, there could be other approaches with more community input, different amount of money, and so forth, that would give us a totally different result. I think at the end of the day, from my perspective, I come back to, this is about giving more people who otherwise live in poverty more dignity, more agency, more control, greater sense of direction about their own lives, and not having programs, services alone trying to micromanage their poverty.
Well, and several of you talked about a vicious cycle, or alluded to the notion of a vicious cycle, and I'm wondering if a reframe is this something that could kickstart a virtuous cycle, right, where you're spiraling upward based on all of these things? And that's something, I think, to the point about that's a future looking inquiry, as opposed to a vicious cycle as a backward looking inquiry. I believe Daniel has a question.
Well, it was the questions for the group, which is one of the things we're doing. So currently, Steelcase Foundation is partnering with UpTogether on a 10-year direct cash work with 30 moms, and I think part of what we're really going into it, we're really wrestling with, is these like sort of traditional, more quantitative measures that don't really account for the felt difference, the dignity that Joe's talking about, and that historically the way that we look at quote unquote like rigorous research is really dismissive of women, and specifically Black women, in what they think, feel, need, as like that's not real information. We're gonna do it this way.
Well, a study like this in particular too, Daniel, sorry to interrupt, but it dismisses them entirely.
That's right.
Right.
That's
it's
right.
not about their outcomes. It's totally about their children. So it's as if we've just sort of cast them to the side or instrumentalized them solely as it relates to their children, what they can offer their children, and maybe in the next generation we'll be able to break the cycle, rather than saying, you know what, these moms, these dads, the parents are human beings too, with dignity, and they deserve our respect. And frankly, this cash might have helped them too, independent of what the outcome for the child was. Sorry to interrupt.
No, and to your point around predicting the future, right. That dignity, that connection, that, like, we don't know what that's going to mean in the long run, which is partially why we were looking at it from 10 years standpoint. What we've learned after this first year with moms that know they've got a 10-year runway is their goals, their ideas are so much, they're incremental, because they know what's coming. They can see there's predictability in a way that isn't, if you have, and this isn't to knock any other program, I don't mean to do that, but if it's for a year, like, you're not going to fundamentally change. You might, you could pay down some debt. There's things that are not bad that can be celebrated, but in terms of this like sort of long-term us as a unit, as a family unit, like how, the trajectory that we're on isn't going to change in 6 months or a year and those types of things. So we're looking at that. And the reason why I'm asking this, or I'm framing it in this way, is the question I have for the group is around, we're talking about opportunities to stop with investing so much in programs. How do we give people money? How do we do that and frame it in a way that creates this sort of cycle up? All of that. One of the worries and the concerns that I have, and that I've voiced to you all in separate conversations, is if we're only sort of like lifting the bottom, the bottom, the sort of, then people end up like the cost of everything just rises. Housing rises, right? We saw this, and we saw this in Kent County where I live. $40 million came in a year and a half to help keep people in their housing, and that same period, the rent went up 33%. We're seeing this with our families. They're getting $1,000 a month. Rent is gone up. Cost of goods has gone up. So and then we say, well, it didn't work. It's like, well, like they're not. It's not even what it. Like they're not. And so the question I have is, how do we? What are you all thinking about ways to potentially, for lack of a better word, like cap the top, right? Like if we just end up with a bunch of cities where people are making $100,000 a year and still can't afford to live or feed their kids. Like, I don't know if we didn't actually solve anything, and I'm worried that we just lift the floor and don't figure out the ceiling. That it becomes a race to a place we never get.
I mean, I understand the problem. I think one of the things that I have thought a lot about, and I'm not an economist, so I don't understand all the nuances necessarily, but two books in particular by Les Leopold and Michael Lind have really shown how the suppression and the stagnation of wages has been consistent since at least the 1970s, and there needs to be some legal and regulatory work done on that. Les Leopold, for example, says we should outlaw stock buybacks again, because corporations use that to juice the pay of executives and lay people off, and he calls it Wall Street's war on workers. I think as well, this is where we can marry this conversation with the abundance conversation, right? Where there's a graph, I think it's from American Enterprise Institute, that shows all the things that have gotten a lot more expensive and all the things that have gotten a lot cheaper. And how do we get the essentials, childcare, healthcare, higher education, housing, much more on the cheaper side than they are now. And things like toys, for example, are way cheaper than they were 40, 50 years ago. So that to me is where a robust program, a liberalism that builds, that Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson talks about, needs to be married with something like cash assistance.
And I think to build on that, two things come to mind to your question, Daniel. I think one, having common goods that we are sharing will inevitably cap their prices, right? Because it takes them out of the market. And that means that if there is an ability for everybody to have access to childcare, actually what we're going to start concentrating on is going to be in developing the jobs that provide quality or high quality childcare instead, rather than thinking about how do I make enough ends meet to compete against that nanny and that 2-to-1 or whatever the case may be. And I actually thought your framing earlier around how do we think about our economy differently from to democratize it in a way that begins to benefit us all, and changing its priorities and its supports. And I think that inevitably has to lead to beginning to create caps. Absolutely. And we can create bodies that can regulate that work. And as we've talked about these topics, I know that that happens in Europe and in other places. But I think ultimately there is this shift in every aspect of our lives that has to begin to happen as to ultimately, what do we want? Is it still about getting the most toys? Or is it for all of us as people to thrive together? And what is the value in that? And what I've seen in the past is that the value for our society is great. It makes our lives better. And we're stagnating right now because we've stopped that creativity, that ingenuity of people to begin to dream about how we can make our lives better together rather than for the individual.
And giving them space, to Daniel's point, for over a 10-year period. I mean, I think there you can't underestimate the importance of the time period, right? And, you know, shareholder dividends are paid in perpetuity, right? It's sort of like a predictable thing. Not predictable in terms of the amount, but they know that there will be some dividend if the company does well, right? And so...
And let's just acknowledge that Daniel leads a philanthropic entity and how unusual a 10-year runway for anything in philanthropy is. And that requires, I would imagine, not only patience from your staff, but the board and so forth. That requires, I would imagine, as well, an awful lot of work. But it's just, we need more funders who are thinking on 10-year, 20-year time horizons and less on 1, 2, and 3 year time horizons.
Yeah, and also to build on already his work. Like, you don't have to start from scratch. You can go and be like, hey, what can we partner with you on this? Can we expand it? And I'm so happy that you brought up the longevity of it, because man, if each of us were given an extra $2,000 a month, how long, and we have been struggling and thinking about our decision making in our households, how long would it take us to begin to figure out, okay, then what's next?
Mm-hmm.
6 months alone just to lift the stress of like, I don't have to be scared about losing food, let alone dreaming about what I'm capable of.
I think it allows you to do two things. It allows you to plan in ways you can't, but it also allows you to have the space to read and react and adapt to changing circumstances. And I think, you know, we won't go down this rabbit hole, but we're entering a time of acceleration, right? Like, everything is changing and the rate of change is increasing. And so there's probably nothing that gives folks the ability to read and react to circumstances better than the things we're talking about here. So
can I just add one last thing, which I always think about it too, the scarcity mentality and the abundance, where nonprofits have, I think, continue to participate in a lot of these programs and services because that's the food that's being fed to them, right? And there's very little time to be able to make different decisions. And I think, Daniel, what you're shifting is being able to say as a foundation, actually, we have the ability not to be thinking hand to mouth, but start thinking long term. And for many organizations like UpTogether, who benefited from the Mackenzie Scott dollars and getting a huge infusion of cash, that gave us the space to not think hand to mouth, but to start dreaming strategically about how to change systems. Like that, to me, for many probably of your listeners, can begin to understand what we're talking about, a shift in our society to be able to act differently.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been incredible. You know, we've been talking, you know, for a while now, and so in the interests of getting out of here at a decent time, I'd love to invite all of you to make, you know, any kind of like comments, final comments. So I'll start with Jesus, Daniel, and Joe.
I'll just start by, Daniel, as you were saying about your work, or Joe pointed it out in the 10 years, part of I think what we need, and I'm remembering when we first met here and went on a walk, on a hike, and beginning to dream about what is possible. And I know that you did a ton of conversations and you picked a lot of brains that gave you the ability, and you had the space to be able to figure that out. And I think in this moment, my thought here is both because of that study and its limiting vision and what people have to be able to be creative and thrive, but for all of us to continue to find these spaces to be able to talk to one another. So just want to say thank you to Jay for holding the space for us, of course.
Yeah, definitely appreciate this space. And in his, you know, what you just said sort of really, you know, pushes me to just, I think, wonder out loud around how we define abundance, and that not as like, you know, dollar signs or more things or more, right? But this abundance that's a much more broad ability to be able to have space to think, the ability to, you mentioned like take your child to, dinner for their birth, like the going on vacation, going to like those types of things. Those are not the arts, cultural activities. Like these are not things that are, nice to have. These aren't things that are, just sort of frivolous things. And
they're non-negotiables.
They're non-negotiables, and we need to. And so as we're having this conversation, my worry is we end up kind of spinning up to abundance of like, well, we need more housing, and it's like when we have a broader. This will be real quick, but when we were meeting with moms preparing, because you're right, we did a lot of listening, we did a lot of work leading into this project, and we had all this data. Childcare costs $13,000 in Kent County per child, and it's like, so if you have 3 kids, we're doing all this math, and we started talking to actual people, and they were like, my mom watches the kids. I just want to be able to give her gas money, right? Mm-hmm. Or I don't actually want to work I don't even want to pay for childcare. I want to be home with my kid, and do that. But I have to work. And so to have to work means this percentage of my paycheck goes to childcare, right? And so sometimes we start asking or we take the wrong lesson from the information, and so that's sort of my wondering in this conversation today is like how might we think about abundance as this like sort of more holistic, leading with curiosity.
That's a great example, and that's we've hammered MAGA a couple times, so we should also say that part of the failure of the liberal establishment, I think, is to impose these elite luxury beliefs about childcare, for example, onto other folks, because a lot of folks who make up, and there's been a lot of conversation and analysis about the sorting and how Democrats are the party of the elite, and the elite would like out of home childcare, so they can work full time. But that's not the reality of, I think, a lot of people's desire for their own life. I think what we're saying collectively is that agency and choice and space to make your own decisions is what we're driving at. So that's just a great example of that.
Yeah, I would just say a couple of things that we're really focused on right now, which is we are living in a time of acceleration that requires us as a country to adopt family policy that is focused on stability, predictability, and quality of family life for every American family. Because as Moynihan reminded us over 50 years ago now, a country that doesn't have a family policy, that is not explicit in protecting and strengthening the predictability and stability of family life, will leave family life prone to destruction by untrammeled forces. And we know what all those forces are today. The disruption that's coming from AI, the disruption of climate change, the demographic change, the responsibilities that parents have increasingly to care for both their children and for aging parents and other aging family members. And then part of that, in my view, is we really need to shift our mindset. And this is going to begin with philanthropy. It's going to begin with advocates. It's going to begin in think tanks that are studying these issues. Shift our mindset from primarily services for low-income families to income. We need many more income strategies rather than services strategies, because I think the lesson of the last 50, 60 years is that those services, well, undoubtedly a lot of them have done a lot of good. What people need are the tools, primarily in the form of money, to make the choices that they feel are best for them, for their children, for their families, and to feel like they have a real stake in the future of the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's always such a pleasure to talk to you all individually and together, and I'm glad we were able to sit and capture it. I'm so grateful to Aspen for the room and the space. I always learn so much listening to you all. So
thanks for pulling us
together.
together.
Thank you. Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
And I don't know what's next, if anything, but this was great.